Me, the angel singing of Jesus' birth didn't sound a lot like that. Will you join me in a word of prayer? Holy God, may the words of my mouth and all of our words, the words that we speak in love, be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. We heard scripture a few minutes ago, and maybe you caught the line, do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent, for I am with you. This text puts me in a bit of a precarious position. I mean, on the one hand, I am all for silence. We have had worship services where we were silent throughout most of the service, over 10 minutes of silence. Our centering prayer group has held silence together this fall every morning before worship. Every time I hear a scripture of Jesus going away to pray, I'm sure he wasn't just chatting up God. I envision that, I understand that as Jesus removing himself to be in the presence of God and to hold silence. Resting in God. Father Thomas Keating explains silence as a way of consenting to God. We need more silence. Our noise in our world is so noisy. You've all heard me say again and again how important silence is. But see, that's the thing. You've heard me talk about how important silence is. Because that's kind of what I do, right? I come up here and I talk. It's my job, at least for a few minutes every Sunday. And so a scripture about silence and speaking is just plain weird for a preacher to have to talk about. It's maybe, I decided it's a pastor's greatest conundrum. I really wanted to say conundrum in church. And so as I found my way, I actually looked up what a conundrum meant. I ended up on literaryterms.net, which included in its description of a conundrum not only being in a place where you're wrestling with two sides, but it talked about it as a love triangle, saying, and I quote, "Love triangles of this sort takes place in such works as Bronte's Wuthering Heights and the Twilight Saga." Something else, the Twilight Saga, I never thought I would say in a sermon. But the love triangle piece of it, I get. I love silence, but certainly speaking has its advantages. And actually not really in the love triangle way, but a conundrum is a lot of what the life of faith really is. Maybe that is the life of faith. As we try to hold together our understanding of a good God and a good world and good people who were created good, and we reconcile that with pain and suffering and the questions big and small, it is a conundrum. I actually thought we should just change the name to Conundrum Church because it wouldn't be that much less complicated than Kirk Brae. But let's go deeper into this conundrum. Today is our final sermon in the series on consent that we have had throughout the fall season. And you might be wondering what all of this has to do with consent. We have defined consent throughout this season, as our children will learn in our OWL program, in 4 ways. Consent must be freely given. Consent must be communicated in mutually understandable words or actions. Consent must be given in the present, and consent must be given for each specific act. Now, silence and consent is tricky. Because within a relationship between two people, silence is not consent. Hear me say that. Silence is not consent by that definition that we used. Often in places of abuse or threatened abuse, the victim is too afraid or unable to speak. And so it's important in conversations of consent not to consider silence a form of consent. Period. Hard stop. That's the end of that. Now I'm going to keep talking, but that doesn't mean that changes how that works in personal relationships, because there is a difference on a societal level. Silence changes our engagement when we talk about how we come together as people, lots of people together. First, we hear the words that came to Paul in the vision. Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent. For God says, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent. That is easier said than done. Did you know when people rated their greatest fear, the number 1 was public speaking. Number 2 was death. But speaking is not a simple thing. Knowing what to say and how to say it, and then putting your words out there for the world to see and hear is not an easy task, because people will disagree with you, and some people will actually don't think that they do, so then you question whether you said everything you wanted to say correctly. But here we hear these words, do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent, for I am with you. And so there's that conundrum, because I still believe we need less talking and more silence in the world. But what God is calling Paul to do is to speak truth in love. Paul uses those words on his next visit. After he is here in this place where we hear today, he goes to Ephesus, and that's where he encourages the church to speak truth in love. And while what the truth might be is impacted by the moment, I do think we do know what our truth is. But speaking it, that takes work, that takes risk. So we hear God calling Paul to speak, to do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent. But in the same text, we hear another story, and often in Scripture you hold the stories together and you look at them next to one another. The story of Gallio, who was the proconsul, which is basically the governor of Achaia. And we read that those who followed the law were ready to attack Paul because he was not bringing people to God and having them follow God the way that they understood as the law prescribed. And Gallio says he doesn't want anything to do with this. They come to him and they want him to hold Paul accountable for these actions. But he says, this isn't my issue. This is regarding religious law and not a crime or a villainy. So he chooses to remain silent on the matter. And the matter that's about to take place. Now, this actually works out well for the Apostle Paul. He doesn't have to go through any political upheaval. And yet the scene doesn't play out how anyone would have expected. After Gallio refuses to speak, the crowd, quote, seizes Sosthenes, an official of the synagogue, and they beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of these things. Sosthenes is described here as an official of the synagogue, so why was he beaten when the people were after Paul? Was it because he failed to stop Paul, because the crowd was riled up and needed an outlet? We don't really know. There are some scholars who believe Sosthenes does indeed convert to Christianity, and this might be a punishment for that choice, but the way the scripture reads, it doesn't sound like that is what is happening. I don't know exactly why this scripture was put in the Bible. Who we're supposed to champion as we read this. I imagine it's Paul, and that this is actually a story of good news, that no charges were brought against him. But when we read it, when we see this act of violence, it gives me pause. Gallio chose to remain silent, and a man was beaten. No matter what the text agenda is, the scripture teaches us that there are consequences for our silence. Did Gallio remain silent because he didn't care if Paul was or wasn't teaching people to worship contrary to the law? Possibly. Possibly it just didn't matter to him. It wasn't his issue. I've heard that a lot. There's so much pain in our world. We struggle to pay the bills and to have civil relationships with certain family members. We are dealing with the diagnosis of someone we love or with ourselves. How in the world are we supposed to hold all of that and care about the isms of the world and climate change and the opioid crisis and all the other things there are to care about? We become so overwhelmed, if not with our own stuff, than with the overwhelming need of the world, that we respond with, well, silence. We might have good intentions, but we do not act on them. What those who are hurting hear, though, is not our good intentions. They hear only our silence. And so we just say, it's not my issue when there is gun violence in another part of the country, or it's not my issue because rising sea levels still won't touch us at a mile high. And yet there are consequences to our silence. There's this quote that comes to my mind every time I hear about another mass shooting: what we allow will continue. Because if we allow it, not on a personal level, but on a societal level, allowing, not working against the things that bother us, it is, in a way, a giving of consent. Because in a society like ours, our voice and our vote and the platforms we have to speak from, to speak our truth in love, and also how we spend or withhold our money or our investments, all of it is our way of granting or denying consent. God said to Paul and says to us, do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent, for I am with you. I love the message Jackie offered to the children. We have a newish mission statement. We actually talked about it last week. But in the process, it was a long 6-month plus process of coming and determining what that mission statement would be. And we had a moment, maybe longer than a moment, in that journey where we wanted to use the metaphor of a playground for all of the things that we did. And it started with one person's suggestion that in our mission statement we say, we are the ones who stand up to the bullies on the playground. What if that defined us as a church? What if we said, there's things that we agree on, there's things that we disagree on, but one thing that we say when we come together, when we gather together, one value that we hold and that we name as a church is that we will stand up to the bullies on the playground. I think it shifts this feeling of being overwhelmed, because we do feel overwhelmed with all of the issues of the world, those that are super close and those that feel so far away. Even if we yelled as loud as we could, our voice could not travel that far. But if we committed, if we agreed to be the ones that stood up to the bullies on the playground, that is a way of living, a way of being, a commitment that we make that says when we are in the presence of pain, of anger, of injustice, that we will take that step. We will not be afraid. We will speak and not be silent. Now it feels the only honest way to go about it is that that's not the whole scripture. God says to Paul, do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to harm you, for there are many in this city who are my people. Now we can't always guarantee that. There is this sense of speak and do not be silent because there's nothing to fear. The Bible tells us over and over and over again not to be afraid, but it doesn't really say that there's nothing to fear. You know, I kept going back as I was reading this text to a passage that is pretty often repeated. It's found in both Matthew and in the book of James. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. Other translations say, let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Think about what that means. Do not be afraid. Speak your truth in love. Speak and do not be silent. Think about the things that you have said yes to the relationships you have said yes to your commitment to God that you have said yes to, the way in which you want to live your life that you have said yes to. Or think about the things you have said no to, the attitudes or the spirits that you don't want to embody, the ways in which you don't want to walk and live in the world. I mean, there's nothing more consenting than this text. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. These are words of faith. Think about those words as a part of your faith. What have you said yes to? And what would change if you allowed your yes to be yes and your no to be no? Have you said yes to following Jesus? Have you said yes to come to church? Have you said yes to forgive? Have you said yes to go out of your way to care for the earth by recycling or something with other intentionality? Have you said yes to walking in the way of Jesus? To speak truth to power, to step up and step in, to be the kid on the playground who stands up to the bullies? Is your yes, yes? Is your no, no? When you see someone hurting someone or something, do you say something or do you just pretend you didn't see it? Let your yes be yes and let your no be no. When we fail to speak, when we fail to act, when we silence our own questions or silence others, when we do not engage in issues because, like the Leo, they are not our issues, or because the issues are too big, or when we are moving around in this world, in this playground in which we live, and we find ourselves in a conundrum, and we don't know which way to go or what to do. We listen. Jackie talked about it as a feeling in your stomach, or maybe in your heart, or maybe in your hands, maybe in your head, maybe all around us. What if we thought, what have I said yes to? And allowed, or what have I said no to, and allowed those choices we have already made, the consent we have given or denied, to lead us to not be afraid, but to speak and not be silent. I know that's not an easy thing. Maybe it's ultimately impossible. But gathering together, doing this work of the life of faith, is working towards that, to make our yes a little bit more yes today. I keep thinking of Carrie Fisher. I couldn't remember her real name. I had to look up Princess Leia. But she said, what's important is the action. You don't have to wait to be confident. Just do it and the confidence will follow. She said, stay afraid, but do it anyway. Now our scripture said, do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent. And I'm not putting Princess Leia up with scripture. But I think there's something for us too. If we're going to be those people that stand up for the bullies on the playground, that when we find ourselves in places where we know that we need to speak and act on behalf of the yeses we have spoken in our hearts and in our lives and in our relationships, maybe her words can guide us too. Stay afraid, but do it anyway.